I wanted to welcome everyone to our webinar. I'm so excited to be hosting this webinar and so excited for our guests to join us and share with us their knowledge about our rights as special ed parents for fall 2021 in public schools. Welcome Allison Hertog and Chris Eisenberg, special ed attorneys. I'm so grateful for you to share your knowledge with us. And to begin, I am Lisa Moscow, the mother of two kids with learning differences. I'm also the Director of Advocacy for Educational Rights at Speak Up. And I'm looking forward to this webinar. First, a little bit of housekeeping. This will also be interpreted. We have our wonderful interpreter, Sonia, with us today. So if you've registered and are in the Zoom webinar, click on the globe at the bottom and you can get interpretation live. Si necesitan interpretación, pueden ver el globo allí al bajo que dice interpretación y cliquear allí para poder escuchar en español. Also know that this is being streamed live on Facebook so that it may be watched by a broader audience and even watched later if you need to review. And participants who are in the webinar may put their questions in the chat, and we will be pausing periodically so that I may present your questions to Chris and Allison. So now I'm going to hand it over to our special ed lawyers, Chris and Allison. And first, before you guys launch into the webinar, I hope you can share with us your whys. So I'll start with you, Chris. Go ahead.
My why. My why is my 17-year-old son. When he was 2, he was diagnosed with autism, and all 3 of my kids are at LAUSD, and that was the beginning of the journey. I like to refer to him as my first client, and that was the inspiration for me becoming a special education attorney.
Thank you so much, Chris. That's a very good reason. And Allison Hertog, go ahead.
I do this because I was actually a special ed student myself. I have overcome learning disabilities, but unfortunately I went through a lot of struggle. My parents were told I would never go to college, and I was retained in the 2nd grade. So for me, I first became a special education teacher. Now I'm a special ed attorney, and for me, this is my life's work.
That's pretty incredible, Allison. I hope you can write an op-ed piece about it and remind and kids with disabilities that they should never have anyone place any limitations on them. So thank you. So now I'm going to go to share screen, and I'm going to be sharing the webinar. And we will begin. So take it away.
We're on, okay.
There we go. Shall we go to the next slide?
Next slide.
And we reviewed today's presenters. So, okay, here we go.
Okay, everyone. So we have a lot of information to go to today, and I'm so happy to be here, and I'm going to try, or we're going to try to make this as straightforward as possible. There's a lot of technical information about face masks and compensatory education and independent study and hospital homebound and alternative dispute resolution. And it's all pretty technical, but we're going to give as much information as we can, answer questions. Please also understand that the law is changing rapidly. There's going to be a new bill, state bill, which they're calling a cleanup bill, which will kind of add more clarification to independent study and maybe some of the other issues that are happening right now. And of course, the pandemic is always changing. We know that LAUSD school board just made an announcement about mandating vaccines. So we're trying to be as up to date as possible in this presentation, but know that if you need individual advice about your child, you should consult an attorney who can apply the most, current laws to your individual situation. Next slide. Okay, this is a very dense slide, and I'm not going to read everything in it, but essentially the good news is that federal and state laws remain the same, meaning your children have the same rights they had before the pandemic. Those rights have not gone away. So they still have a right to what's called a free, appropriate public education in the federal law. And even as in the wake of the pandemic, the federal government, which is that time was Betsy DeVos, made an announcement that kids may be entitled to compensatory education, services to compensate for what they lost during distance learning. So that's something we're going to go into in a little more detail. There's also there's been lots of state guidance and laws in the interim, which I referred to a little bit at the bottom of this slide. But for now, let's move on. Next slide. Chris, this is
Thank you,
yours.
Allison. Yes, it is. So let me jump in. So let's talk about some of the back to school, if you're going back to school in person, some of the protocols that are in place. We're going to focus mostly on LAUSD, as I know a lot of you have children at LAUSD. As I mentioned before, all three of my kids are at LAUSD, so I'm very familiar with this. The one thing I want to point out first is that I want you as a parent to keep in mind that you do have the right to keep your child home if you think that your child is too high risk for COVID, or the consequences of catching COVID would be too high risk. So if your determination as a parent is to keep your child home, then that's what you should do. Don't let your school district bully you into making a different decision. So let's talk about the specific LAUSD COVID protocols. The first is that every student must have a daily pass. That's something that is issued every morning. Like I said, I've got 3 kids with them, so I know exactly how it's done. The first thing you need to do when you sign on to the parent portal is just click a box that says your child doesn't have symptoms. Also click something saying that your child has not been directly contacted with someone who has COVID. And if that's the case, you are able to get the daily pass. Sometimes parents print them. Sometimes there's a screenshot taken. Kids who have their own phones are able to use the daily pass on their own phone and get in that way. Now, if your child is not able to get a daily pass, the school is able to check them in anyway. It's obviously going to be a longer line to get in and take a bit more time. And by the way, every school now has these lines, these daily pass lines where the kids are being checked in. A face mask is required, and we are going to talk in some depth in a moment on face masks. Lisa, did you have a question?
Well, we already have a question in the chat.
Is it okay? Hit me.
It's related to the daily pass.
Okay.
Hi, my child has not been tested at school for the past 3 weeks, but a daily pass has been generated until today.
If it's a student at LAUSD, that's surprising to me, because usually they're being tested every week or at least every other week when there's a short week like last week, which is only 3 days. So they may not be aware that their child's being tested. I'm not sure. I mean, I can't address that specifically, but I think every child at LAUSD schools is being tested. So they might want to check with the school and find out that their children are being tested. My understanding is there was a baseline test, again, which all 3 of my kids had to take within 2 weeks of school starting. This was, beginning of August, and then every student is tested at school weekly. I would think they would reach out if there weren't tests being done. Maybe the parent hasn't consented to the tests. I couldn't tell you without more information.
Just another detail sheet put on the chat. It is LAUSD, and the school has acknowledged to her that the child was only tested on the first day of school, and that there's no processes in place to catch these fails, basically. So
interesting. The tests are not, the schools are running the tests without parent involvement. So every week it happens within the school, and I don't know what day it is or when my kids are being tested. If I go on that parent portal, I can see the last time a test was taken. Maybe the parent should look at that, but maybe they're just slipping through the cracks and LAUSD missed it. So
Right.
I'm not sure. I know it's something that's being taken very seriously. Certainly, my kids are at 3 different schools, so I get to see, the inner workings of all 3 schools with the passes. If a student does have a positive test, there's contact tracing done by the school, and every student that's been around the student who had a positive test that's within 6 feet, not necessarily just in the same classroom, they're quarantined for 10 days. Now, the quarantine is going to go away for students that have been vaccinated. If they're over 12 and been vaccinated and they're near someone that has a positive test, that will go away after the vaccination mandate takes place. This is something that I actually went through with my youngest. She was around someone who had COVID in the summer bridging program and had to be quarantined for 10 days. I was annoyed by it, a little bit frustrated, because we've been doing so much to keep our kids safe, but realized that it's just part of the process. It's going to happen to a lot of kids. And I actually think there's a lot I can find fault with LAUSD, but I think they're doing a good job of keeping this spread of COVID down in the schools. And we've only had, I think, 7 schools that have had community spread over the hundreds of schools that are within the LAUSD district. So I think that portion of it is going well. Next slide, please, Lisa.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll go to the next slide, but I would just add that if the school is not testing, as this parent is saying, that a good idea would be to file a universal complaint process. Go to the UCP, look up UCP on LAUSD website, and you can file a complaint.
Yeah, I would even reach out just to the school principal and say, why isn't my kid being tested? See what they have to say. Okay, so face masks. This is a big subject. It's something that's coming up a lot. We're going to look at both Los Angeles regulations and California regulations as far as face masks. The one thing I'd want to say before we get into this is that no matter what the guidance or regulations say, that there's no face mask exemption to the IDEA, the federal law that governs what children with special needs or IEPs are entitled to. So keep that in mind, and also that a student is still entitled to a FAPE, a free appropriate public education. We're going to be saying FAPE a lot tonight, even if they can't wear a face mask. So even if they're not able to wear a face mask, they are still entitled to FAPE. So let's start with the Los Angeles Department of Health. This is from late August. Masks are now required again in all indoor public places as a result of the Delta variant. And they are aware that kids, that appropriate and consistent use of masks may be challenging for some children. And they, particularly ones that have disabilities. And what they should be doing is asking their doctor for advice about wearing a mask, and if the doctor will write an exemption letter. Now, what you find with all the regulations and guidance we look at is they're somewhat ambiguous. It doesn't state if you get the exemption letter, you're allowed back in school. It just says that this is something that you should be doing. And a lot of parents are having frustration because they get the exemption letter and they're still not allowed back in school. If we go to the next slide, please, Lisa. So this is the California Department of Education guidance. Now, this is the most student-friendly. This was issued in the spring of 2021. And they reiterate the federal law, the IDEA law, and state that students with disabilities must not be excluded from educational environments if their disability prevents them from wearing a face mask. And that LEAs, which are local education agencies or usually school districts, must continue to adhere to least restrictive environment requirements. And also that it's imperative that they avoid implementation of policies related to face coverings that may result in a denial of FAPE, free appropriate public education, under the IDEA. So they're stating pretty clearly here that the school still has to provide FAPE, and they have to be aware of the least restrictive environment, which would demand that a student's allowed in school even if they're not wearing a mask. However, if we go to the next slide, the California Department of Public Health is not on the same page as the CDE, the Department of Education. So they restate that Los Angeles requirements that students in all grade levels are required to wear face coverings at all times unless they have a medical or mental health condition or disability. In regard to assessing for those exemptions, that's a medical determination that must be made by a physician or other medical professional. They also state that persons exempted must wear a non-restrictive alternative such as a face shield, but they also say as long as their condition permits it. So what that says to me is if you're getting a note from a doctor and your child can't wear a face shield either, you want the doctor to note that in the letter that my child can't wear a face shield, can't wear a face mask because of the specific disability, maybe there's sensory issues, maybe other issues that prevent it. Again, it's ambiguous. It's not clear as to whether the child should be allowed back at school or not, but you definitely have to get a doctor's note. Now, there's one thing, and this is pretty recent, that's very concerning. The CDPH does seem to concede that students may be kept at home for not wearing a face mask. Specifically, I'm quoting them, schools should offer alternative educational opportunities for students who are excluded from campus because they will not wear a face covering. So they're saying, hey, you've got to be able to do distance learning if the child can't wear a face mask, but yet that may violate FAPE, that may be a denial of FAPE, that may be a denial of least restrictive environment. And again, is what I started off by saying with face masks, is that the state guidance and regulations do not overrule the federal regulations in regards to FAPE and the IDEA. Next slide, please. So we have some suggestions as far as best practices. One you might have guessed is that you've got to get a note from a doctor if your child cannot tolerate a face mask. Another thing is we would suggest trying to work with your child to acclimate them to wearing a face mask. So you might want to start a token economy, for example, reward your child for wearing a mask for 1 minute, for 5 minutes, and on from there. There's certainly a lot of places you need to wear a mask. So if it's possible, and we know with some kids it simply isn't, but if it's possible, to start working with your child to see if you can begin to acclimate them. And then the last part of this would be in regards to the IEP, make wearing a face mask a goal in your child's IEP so that you're making the school a partner in this in regard to the face mask, rather than just completely being at odds with them. I know it's not always possible with some children, but to the extent that it is, you want to try and work with the school. Next slide, please. There was a lot on face masks, so we're done with face masks, unless you guys have questions, which we're certainly happy to answer. So we're going to talk about a couple laws. One of them is AB 104, which became a law in July of this summer, and it allows for the following. If a parent believes that a child should be retained, a parent can make a written retention consultation request, and the school must hold a retention consultation within 30 calendar days of the request. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of retention, that's holding a child back a grade, but if you really feel it's something that needs to happen, you can make this request. It must be written. In addition, you can request a pass or no pass grade rather than a letter grade. If you request this, it happens. There doesn't need to be a meeting about it or anything. And then in regards to students in the 3rd or 4th year of high school, if they're not on track to graduate, they can get a 5th year of instruction. Again, like the pass or no pass, this is merely something that needs to be requested. There does not need to be a meeting about it. And now I'd like to turn it back to Allison.
Hi, that certainly is a very controversial area, the face mask. There's so much confusion and so many children who are being left out of school because of that. Okay, so I'm going to cover this area called compensatory education. What this is, it's sometimes called Comp-Ed, but it's services to compensate for what your child lost. And this is part of the law which protects the federal law, which protects students with disabilities. So if your child is denied a FAPE let's say during distance learning, compensatory services would put them back in the place they would have been if distance learning had not happened. So what this typically involves is a parent filing a complaint for due process, and as the remedy of the due process complaint, they may get compensatory education. Now, what does that mean? That means tutoring for, let's say, the SAI they lost. It means therapy sessions for the therapy sessions they lost. It could mean social skills groups for the social interaction or the behavioral services they lost. It could mean any number of things. Next slide, please. Okay, so what triggers a parent's claim to comp ed services? Meaning, so if you lost a FAPE, a free appropriate public education, due to school closures, you may be entitled to compensatory education. What does that mean? That means, okay, your child is entitled to progress at a reasonable rate given their individual circumstances. And if they did not progress appropriately during the pandemic, you may be entitled to compensatory services. Next slide. Okay, so like I said, this is part of the federal law which protects students with disabilities. But how do you show that your child is entitled to it? How do you show that they didn't progress at a reasonable rate? So what you would show, if let's say you could either start by doing this at an IEP meeting, you may have to file a due process complaint, but you could start at an IEP meeting by saying, look, my child lost a lot. They couldn't pay attention on the screen, for instance. They often couldn't log into Schoolology. They didn't submit assignments. Maybe they didn't even get assignments. They didn't post any messages. They didn't have any engagement. You want to look at, okay, were they getting synchronous instruction mostly or asynchronous instruction? Obviously, synchronous instruction, which I think all of us unfortunately know what that means, the difference between the two is now. The synchronous instruction is obviously better than asynchronous. Then you would want to say, well, my child didn't get, his therapies, his or her therapies. They didn't get SLT therapy. They didn't get OT therapy, or maybe they got it, but it was ineffective because it was online. They maybe didn't get their supplemental support, which the most classic sort of form of supplemental support is an aid or a BII support. There are some kids who had a BII try to provide them support online, and others didn't. So, and then you want to show how your child is performing now, like the difference between where they were performing before the pandemic and how they're performing now. Maybe they didn't make a lot of progress. Maybe they didn't meet their goals. Maybe they have social or emotional regression. Maybe they need new goals. One way to try to make the case for this by yourself without filing for due process is to ask, next slide, please, is to ask for some informal assessments at an IEP meeting. So you might ask for, some of you may have heard of a STAR reading test or iReady, or some other form of informal assessment that a teacher could give. So you can show how they're performing now and how maybe they didn't make a lot of progress from last year, or maybe they even regressed. And so this is very different from what LAUSD may be offering you in an IEP meeting. They may be offering something called recoupment. Remember, the federal government said in March 2020, this was the Trump administration, that children may be entitled to comp ed. They did not say children may be entitled to recoupment, which is a kind of ambiguous, service. It's not individualized. Comp ed, always remember this, comp ed is based on the federal law which protects your children. Anything else is not based on the federal law which protects your children. Next slide. So at a school meeting, LAUSD or the representatives there may be trying to railroad you into taking recoupment services, which is likely a lot less than comp ed. So generally what we understand LAUSD is offering to those parents who request it is not individualized. So remember, I just went through all these individual factors relating to your child, like whether they logged in, what they learned, what they didn't learn, whether they met their goals. Those are all individual. Recoupment is not individualized. It's often given to a whole class at one time, general ed students with IEP students, and it's based on general info. It's not based on those assessments, which I was asking you all to request. It's just based on what maybe they think your child missed, or maybe they think they should go over. It's very different from services to compensate for what your child lost. Schools may tell you in an IEP meeting, for instance, that you're not entitled to compensatory education, even though it's very clear from the federal law and from court cases interpreting federal law that kids are entitled to comp ed. So don't take that for an answer. Next slide. Okay, now this is another way that—
Allison, may
Yeah.
we pause here for a second? We have a couple of questions.
Okay,
And how do I go backwards? I'm gonna have to stop share for a second. My apologies. Oh, my cursor disappeared. Well, figured it out. Perfect. There was a question for Chris on the face masks. Chris, did you? And then after that, we have a question about what you just spoke about, Allison. But first, Chris, did you want to address the question about the face masks?
This is in regard to the medical exemption.
Yes.
Okay. I'd have to look at the document itself, but what I'd say is that the school does have a right to certain medical records in regards to the student. You keep in mind that your student's going to be at the school 6 hours a day, 5 days a week. You don't want to keep away. Now, certainly if they're overreaching in terms of the medical records they're asking for, that's one thing, but they do have a right to certain records in terms of being able to appropriately take care of your child. I mean, that is a responsibility they have, and they do have a right to contact the doctor directly. So it really would depend on what that specific document that that Barb is being asked to sign, as far as whether that's an overreach or not.
So that's a tricky one. Thank you, Chris.
Yes, definitely tricky.
And then we have another question from Claudia. And her question is that her child did not receive all of his or her therapies, but since the pandemic, the child has moved to a new school. And can the new school still offer him compensatory education?
the new school in the same school district could, because it's the same entity which is responsible. Now, if you move to a different school district, you would have to appeal to the old school district that did the violation to get the compensatory services.
So is it possible to proceed with your IEP at your new school, but then have the old district offer you some of the old services via compensatory time? Like, how does that actually work?
Well, if it's the same school district,
Mhm.
if these are schools are all within LAUSD, for instance, then they're still part of the same entity that's responsible. So yes, it wouldn't be the school that was giving you comp ed, it would be the district.
Okay. Thank you. And then we have another question from Marta. Can you retain or hold back a student? In order to hold back a student, do you have to have an IEP meeting? And does the whole IEP team have to be present at the meeting in order to approve this holding back the kid?
So I think that this may be a question for Chris, if you're talking about retention based on the new rules related to the pandemic.
So Chris, if you want to retain your child, do you have to have an IEP team meeting?
No,
And does the whole team have to be there?
no, it's not an IEP team meeting. In fact, it doesn't even have to be a student that has an IEP or a student with special needs. So it's just anyone who feels that that their student has suffered as a result of last year, a pandemic. Maybe it's a situation where they did not have the proper devices and just couldn't access distance learning, for example. Then they could ask for retention. I would say that I would suggest that best practices would be that you'd want to combine the IEP team and the retention consultation team together so you could talk about the best solutions for your child. And it may be that comp ed is a better solution than retention. Like I said, I'm not the biggest fan of retention, generally speaking, but we've been through kind of an extraordinary 18 months, so I wouldn't want to rule it out either.
And that's fair. So you can meet with IEP team to discuss, but it doesn't have to happen. You don't have to meet with them. They don't have to approve this.
That's correct.
And then we have another question. If a school has a right to certain medical documents, is a school held to the same HIPAA requirements as a medical profession?
I imagine that's in regards to confidentiality, and yes, absolutely.
Okay. And okay. So, and we do have a question from someone saying, if they need to follow up, will they be able to contact you guys and offline with you?
Yeah, of course.
Definitely, and you'll see a link or information on our email addresses and our phone number at the end. So
Perfect.
definitely.
Okay, I'll go to the next slide. That's the end of our questions for now. Sorry, another one popped in. Is a child eligible for compensatory education if he is academically behind?
Okay, so this depends on whether the fact that they're behind is resulted from distance learning. So they may be entitled to it. It just depends. If the child was behind before the pandemic, and let's assume that, you know, nothing else before the pandemic would entitle them to compensatory education. If they're behind before and they're behind after, at the same rate, they may not be entitled to it. But if they were a little bit behind before the pandemic and now they're a lot behind, they may be entitled to comp ed.
Okay, thanks, Allison. I'm going to go to the next slide. Keep the questions coming, guys. These are really important. Okay.
Okay, so the state decided that there were going to be enormous numbers, thousands of due process complaints from parents across the state, which would be seeking compensatory education. And they're probably right. So they said, in order to stave off thousands of due process complaints, let's say in LAUSD, we're going to create this fund right now for alternative dispute resolution, so that maybe fewer parents will file due process and more parents will pursue ADR. I think LAUSD is calling it ADRS for some reason. And that this will be a better solution for school districts than having thousands of due process complaints, that it's better to have ADR than due process complaints. This is the idea. But as a parent of a disabled child, you need to know the differences between ADR and filing a due process complaint. So a due process complaint or a mediation request is a complaint to the state saying that there are violations in your district, violations of the law. An administrative law judge is assigned. Usually, I think 98% of these cases settle either in a resolution session or in mediation, but they could proceed to a due process hearing, which is prolonged and can be stressful for parents. It does, however, it falls under the IDA, it falls under federal law. So this administrative law judge is applying federal law and is keeping your child's rights in mind. And if you hire an attorney, the attorney's fees can be reimbursed. Now, ADR is very different. At ADR, there'll be a local administrator there. It's supposed to be much quicker than due process. Supposed to be, once it's scheduled, well, you have to get it scheduled, but once it's scheduled, it's supposed to be over within 15 days. If you bring an attorney, your attorney cannot get the fees reimbursed. So either the attorney is working pro bono or you're paying the attorney's fees. This is the most critical distinction in my mind, this last one. The law need not be followed in ADR. They're just trying to come to some resolution that will be acceptable to both sides. But the parents' rights under federal and state law won't necessarily be followed. So, there are pros and cons, and you have to consider this. Now, that said, I did a thorough search of the LAUSD website. I struggled to find any information on alternative dispute resolution. I found this one link that's highlighted in this slide, but it was comparing ADR to something called IDR, which you may know about, but it didn't tell parents how they could seek ADR. So it's kind of a murky process right now, and the LAUSD, I think, would prefer that you just go with the recoupment model, which I mentioned before, which is not individualized and just something that's provided to everyone in the school. Okay, next slide. I think this is on to Chris.
May we pause for questions? We do have a couple questions that popped out. We have a question from Elena, which is, do we have to ask for an IEP meeting to ask for compensatory services?
No, that's one way to do it. That's one way to do it. You could try to get it in an IEP meeting. Alternatively, you could just request ADR or request a due process hearing. So you don't have to do it at an IEP meeting. That's just one idea to try it.
An IEP meeting is a good way to start, because going to due process is much more time consuming and potentially expensive. I like, in most cases, if possible, I do like to start with the IEP, see if you can work something out there, and then you can go to the other alternatives, starting with the demand letter or ADR or filing for due process, for example.
So hopefully start with IEP meeting, hopefully it's taken care of. And if not, issue a demand letter, file for mediation or independent dispute resolution or alternative dispute resolution, but be careful with alternative dispute resolution, or call a lawyer. Is that a
Or
good,
state complaint, now that I think about
or file a state complaint?
Yeah, actually, I don't think, I'm not sure. I think that ADR has been, there's funds set aside in ADR for specifically for this comp ed process. I don't know if the same is true for IDR. IDR was the thing that LAUSD has engaged in prior to this bill, which put a lot of money into alternative dispute resolution. So I'm not sure you could do it through IDR.
Okay.
IDR, they don't seem to be doing it as much, but IDR was something that was after you had said, hey, I'm not happy with the IEP, but before you decided to file either for due process or mediation.
One thing I'd say is remember that while due process can be expensive in terms of attorney's fees, there are lots of attorneys, you know, such as myself, who are willing to take these cases on contingency, meaning you won't owe very much or you'll owe very little until a resolution, a settlement. And again, most of these things go to settlement. And I think you have a lot of leverage if you, in my experience, if you file a due process complaint.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. A lot of times you need to file the due process complaint in order to get that leverage, in order to get the school to pay attention. And what Allison says about the contingency is exactly right, because if you do settle or you do prevail at mediation or due process, the school has to pay the attorney's fees so the parent doesn't have to. So it does allow for parents without money to pay for an attorney to be able to afford an attorney. That's probably not the best way to say it. But many attorneys like Allison and myself will take on pro bono clients when we think there's a good case, with the expectation that it's the school that will have to pay us, not the parent.
That's helpful to know, because, you know, parents who are not able to afford attorneys are at a terrible disadvantage. And that is a huge problem in equity in our system.
And that's where the ADR really falls short, I think, because if you're, you know, I did have an ADR that worked very well, but it was for wealthy parents who were paying for me anyway. And when the school suggested an ADR and it was the settlement they gave was very reasonable, except for not paying for attorney's fees, that was fine with them. But that wouldn't be an option that, you know, I think 80% of LAUSD families are under the poverty line. That wouldn't be an option that they had.
Yeah, that's super problematic. We have another question, and I'm just going to read it out loud. My daughter just started her preschool 2 weeks ago. She's 4 years old and nonverbal and non-mobile. I received a weekly update email from her teacher stating what all the activities they do in the classroom with her, with which I'm pretty satisfied. But she also mentioned about lifting my daughter every time they go out and in from the classroom, which is getting difficult for her teacher. We have an upcoming IEP meeting, so what should I do regarding this? She uses a normal stroller. Her teacher wants me to get a mobility equipment for her. What do I need to do with the situation? Please suggest.
What you should do, the school system is required to allow, you know, to use devices or equipment at their expense if it's required for your child to access their education. So if your child can't, let's say, go outside without the teacher carrying her, which is, I can see that would be problematic because the teacher has a lot of other stuff to do. And it potentially is not safe for your child or for the other kids in the class for the teacher to carry your child. Then the school does have to provide equipment so that your child can do the things that the other children are doing. And for instance, like this makes me wonder about what's happening in the preschool class, how your child is able to get, let's say, from station to station, like they have stations in pre-K, like the kitchen station or the Lego station or the book station, whatever it is. How does your child get from station to station if she's not mobile? That is very concerning because the teacher obviously can't be there to take your child to all these different places. The teacher also doesn't know, like it's supposed to be a big point of pre-K is that your child learns about these different things in our society, about books, about building, and builds skills as independently as possible. And I don't see how your daughter would be able to do that without some kind of equipment or chair or something in the classroom. So yes, they need to do that.
It might also make sense to request an aid as well as a device. And the IEP
Correct.
the IEP is definitely the place to do that. I would also recommend making sure that teacher who's lifting up the child be present at the IEP so the teacher can speak to the specific difficulties that they're having in terms of the non-mobile child.
Such a good suggestion. We also have a
But
question.
disclaimer, this is not legal advice. We'll get to the disclaimer later. So,
Good to know.
but from what we saw, yeah.
We have a question. Can you please provide an example of what you mean that the law need not be followed? This seems non-binding if the law is not adhered to. Does the child really benefit?
That's a very good question. Let me explain a little bit. So what comes out of an ADR resolution session is a binding agreement. So yes, whatever you agree to is binding. What I'm saying is that because there's no judge at the helm of an ADR session, no one is holding the district to necessarily, not holding the district to the law. They're not necessarily following the child's rights. So it could just be like, let me give an example. So let's say in an ADR agreement, let's take this pre-K case. The agreement was that the child, what would it be? The child could, let's say, crawl over. Everything was okay within the classroom because the child could crawl over to the different stations. Okay, and they didn't need an aid or they didn't need equipment. Well, that might be something a parent would agree to if they didn't know what their rights were, and they may not have an attorney present at ADR because attorney's fees are not covered. But that would not be following the law. The law says that a child who is non-mobile is entitled to get, entitled to get the support he or she needs in order to access their education, just like typically developing peers. So the law would say, as Chris and I are talking about, that she should have an aid or some kind of equipment in the class. But that parent might not know that. And so they might agree that, oh, it's okay. It's okay. It's okay for her not to do it in the classroom, not to have equipment in the classroom. She only needs the equipment when she goes outside. I'm making this up. So that's what I mean, that the law need not be followed.
Thank you, Allison. I think that was a really good example. We also have a question. If you use ADR, how are those funds distributed? And what forms are available online for ADR?
Those are excellent questions. Like I said, I couldn't find any forms online for ADR. Now, I believe that Lisa Moscow, our host, is having another session specifically about ADR, and some of these questions may be answered.
Yeah.
But in my research, I could not find any forms online for ADR at the LAUSD site. And I could, it's also, right now, it's not completely clear what the funds are used for and how they're distributed. We know they cannot be used for attorney's fees. They're supposed on either side. So they couldn't be used for the district's attorneys or for the parents' attorneys. But we don't know how those are going to be distributed to children and under what circumstances they will be distributed.
Okay. We have a couple more questions. Do you want to take these questions now, or should we proceed and then loop back?
What time is it?
Why don't we?
Yeah, proceed, right?
Yeah,
And then
I was
loop
going to say
back.
let's finish up, and
We
then
will get to your questions, but okay.
right, we might
So
answer.
for the next slide.
Okay, back to me. So we're going to talk about going back to school and the independent study programs that are out there. This is a result of California law AB 130 that was also passed in July. And AB 130 mandates that every school district must offer independent study, quote, for a pupil whose health would be put at risk by in-person instruction as determined by the parent or guardian of the pupil. So again, as we said earlier, if you think it's unsafe for your child with special needs to go to school, then they don't have to go. They don't have to go to in-person school. And independent study was one of the programs that was put together to help children that are staying home. So this isn't necessarily children with special needs. This can be any child that a parent wants to stay home because of the pandemic. Obviously, we're focusing on children with special needs, children that have IEPs. Again, focusing more on LAUSD, their independent study program is known as City of Angels. So the first thing I'd want to mention is that certain guardrails were put in place for independent study. So for grades K through 3, there's daily synchronous instruction. Now, the synchronous instruction can be minimal. That can be, 5 minutes, 15 minutes a day, very, very little, but it does have to be daily. 4 through 8, it's daily live interaction and weekly synchronous instruction. And grades 9 through 12 is also weekly synchronous instruction. So there are certain guardrails, but they're very minimal. And let's go to the next slide. And what we're going to focus on is the fact that independent study seems to have been created without children with IEPs in mind, or without children with special needs in mind. Now, I think Allison mentioned earlier that there is a cleanup bill that's been proposed. I think I heard about it for the first time last week, and we're hopeful that they may come in with some, they may clean up AB 130 to deal with some of the issues we're going to raise right now. Wait, no, I'm still.
Right.
Don't get ahead of me, please. So what AB 130 says is that a student with an IEP, quote, shall not participate in independent study, unquote, unless their IEP team, quote, specifically provides for that participation. So even the people who drafted AB 130 realize that independent study may not be the best program for children that have IEPs or children with special needs. What independent study is, it seems first and foremost, is a packet of material that's delivered to students where the students are more or less completing it on their own. They're able to check in with teachers if they have questions, or maybe work with their parents, but they don't have the type of certainly in-person instruction. That, of course, is impossible for them because their parents don't want them to go to school, but it's not even the distance learning that we saw last year. Oh, still not.
I'm having problems with my cursor. Excuse
Okay.
me. Hold on. Let me try to go back.
That's okay. I can just keep going.
You back?
Um,
Back. Okay.
You're back. Okay. So, so the problem with AB 130, and AB 130 does not offer solution, which is why why California, the state legislators are looking at a cleanup bill, is that many students with IEPs can't participate in independent study as defined by AB 130. So many children with IEPs who are staying home for health reasons have no access to a free appropriate public education that they're able to, that makes sense for them, because many students are certainly not able to engage with the independent study program as is. So there are other solutions. One of the things that I recommend is calling for the IEP immediately. Now, the IEP team may end up saying, hey, your child is not, this is not suited, this independent study program is not suitable for your child. And the parents generally know this, at least a lot of the clients I've spoken to, but that's the point where you can ask for other solutions, instead of the independent study. So some schools have been open to, for example, hiring a tutor from an NPA, a non-public agency, and providing distance learning, or in some cases, even having the tutor come to the house and do one-to-one learning. Related services such as speech or OT or PT can sometimes be offered via Zoom, sometimes with the parent's help if the parent is willing to do that. Again, there are, I haven't had this yet with LAUSD, if they're willing to offer something beyond City of Angels. I think they're going to have to at some point soon, but there are many school districts that are offering a distance learning that's much more robust than the independent study plan as envisioned by AB 130. One of the options that could be possible there is the home hospital option, and that's something Allison's going to talk about right now. Now you can change the slide.
Now
Please.
I can change the slide. Okay. I'm
Yes,
gonna change
please.
the slide. All right. And now, okay.
There we go.
Okay, hospital homebound or home hospital, whatever you call it. So what I have here on this slide is what's in the California law about the hospital homebound program. I understand that it's not a general education, it's not a special education program. While there are kids who have IEPs who may be in hospital homebound, it's not designed for kids with special needs, sort of like the independent study program, not designed for kids with special needs. So this is where the sort of rubber meets the road here. What it's intended for are kids with a quote unquote temporary disability who can't go to their regular classes in person, or now it's in person, because that's impossible or inadvisable due to a physical, mental, or emotional disability that's meant to be temporary. Okay, so now there are lots of parents, because the independent study program is not ideal for all kids with disabilities, and because some kids with disabilities can't go in person to school because of their health or medical needs, there is an influx of children with disabilities into the hospital homebound program. Now, it's something that LAUSD, and I'm sure lots of other districts around the state, are not at all prepared for this huge influx of students who are who want to be in hospital homebound. The important thing to remember here is that just because your child is in the home hospital program they have not lost their federal or state rights as a child with disability. Next slide, please. So for instance, HH here stands for hospital homebound. So typically, students in the HH program get 1 hour per week of, typically it's in-person instruction in their home. And that may be it, okay? That, however, is not appropriate for kids who have IEPs, who are entitled to more SAI, as well as therapies and supplemental support. That said, because it's one-on-one instruction in hospital homebound, it's more intensive than the kind of instruction you get in a classroom. So it is less, there's not an equation between the number of hours in your IEP of SAI and the number of hours a child with a disability would get in hospital homebound, but certainly it would be more than an hour a day. Okay, the other issue, as some of you may know, Carlson Home Hospital School is generally the home hospital option for kids with disabilities in LAUSD. So there are a couple of things going on here. Because there's such an influx of kids, which the district wasn't prepared for, the instruction right now in hospital homebound is not in person, someone coming into your home, it's online. So this is like more distance learning, and it's 1 hour a day. So this is an option that some parents are willing to take because there's so few options right now that LAUSD is offering for kids who can't be in person and have a disability. But know that if you take this option, you are entitled to more than an hour a day of instruction. You are entitled to a FAPE, a free appropriate public education, and you're entitled to get the therapies. And you're also entitled to have in-person instruction. So, which Carlson says it will be offering down the road, but we have yet to see.
Thanks. Should we pause for questions here, or did you want to? We have a lot
Sure.
of heading up.
Sure.
And bear with me because my cursor is not working. I can't seem to see it. So that's why when you saw me clicking to the next slide, it's because I was trying to click on the chat to see the questions. So hang tight for a second. Let me see if I can get this. No.
Actually, that's the last slide. Should we just get through that before we?
So let's go to the last slide and then I can stop share and then we can go and look at the chat. Okay.
Perfect.
So next slide.
The disclaimer after that. So this is just an alert we put in that we thought was important. School districts, are really pushing for everyone to come back in person. And I think that they get more funding as a result of that as well. So a lot of parents are really feeling the pressure to bring their kids back to school, even if they think their kids would be safer at home. And what we want to make clear is you have a right to keep your kids at home. You have a right to have your children home without waiving your special education rights. So even if the school is sending you the absence notifications every day, even if you told them otherwise, even if they're threatening truancy, stick to your guns and consider contacting an attorney if you're uncomfortable. And let's just get to the disclaimer and then we're done. We can get the questions, which are always the most fun. The contents of this seminar is provided for general information purposes only. The seminar does not give legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. And we're done. So let's go on to.
The last slide is your info, but maybe you can put your info in the chat so I can stop share. I'll leave it up for just a minute so that our viewers on Facebook. And I just want to also add to what you said, Chris, that, for parents who feel that they need to keep their kids home, it's within your rights. Somebody pointed out to me recently Why are you advocating for that when last winter you were advocating for in-person services? And for me, it always boils down to, we have to have the options guaranteed to us by federal and state law. Parents have to have the options for their kids to receive individualized education, free and appropriate public education. And that's really what this is always about, knowing our rights and knowing how to advocate. So I'm going to stop share.
It's important that parents can be able to make the choice that they want to make for what's best for their children.
Exactly.
And there are an awful lot of kids who really needed to get back in school because they were just completely unable to engage with the distance learning. And there are other parents that want to keep their kids home for safety reasons, and all of these parents should be accommodated.
Right. Okay, so I'm going to go back in the chat and look at what we didn't cover yet. My son is now a senior, but he definitely had lots of educational loss. Do you suggest that I request an academic or psychoeducational assessment to ensure we do something about his learning gaps before he graduates? It's an important question because senior year, only 1 year left. Do we do this now?
Yeah, get an assessment. Absolutely.
It's worth it.
Yes, but also make sure that you file for due process before he graduates. So that's really critical too, because I don't know how long an assessment is supposed to take. 60 days, at least for an initial assessment. But the concern is that it may take a while, and your child needs to get remediated as soon as possible.
Once they graduate, they no longer have access to these rights. So as Allison said, it's crucial.
I have a follow-up question to that. So if your child would theoretically be owed compensatory time because he did not receive services, but he's graduated, does that mean you can't get the compensatory time after you've graduated?
If you didn't file
Right.
before, you need to file before you graduate in order to get the compensatory time
Okay.
Afterwards.
So then you could, if you do file and get the compensatory time, you're in a sense, you're extending the services past the graduation date via the compensatory time.
This may be a situation where they take advantage of that AB 104 and ask for a fourth or fifth year to properly get all the credits they need to graduate high school with a high school diploma as well.
Got it.
Without knowing more of the situation, but that is something that could be considered.
Good to know. Okay, I'm going to go to the next question. My son is no longer in special ed, and he no longer has an IEP or 504 plan, but he's in the 5th grade and he's 5'8", big, tall kid. And he complains that he has back pain and that his desk is too low. Is it possible to tell the school to get him a higher desk and seat and chair?
But you can always ask.
You can ask.
always ask.
Without a disability, you won't be able to ask for that under the IDEA or the state law.
I don't know.
But it would make sense that, that you should ask and that they should accommodate him.
I wonder if the parent thinks this is actually related to the disability for which he had the IEP before. Might it be worth requesting a 504 plan to, kind of restart that conversation, saying, well, we close the IEP, he no longer needs something as comprehensive as an IEP, but we still see a little bit of that disability there. Maybe he needs a 504.
I was thinking along the lines of 504 as well.
Okay.
That if there is a disability there, that 504 is a much wider net, and it seems such a simple fix, just larger desk, right? Larger seating area. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so then the next question is, I currently have a child with an IEP, independent study for English and math via a program called Accelis. Does AB 130 cover questions regarding specific needs for an aid for test proctoring or matters such as this?
It does not.
Okay.
So that's something to bring up in the IEP, that you need an aid as well as, or you know, your specific needs. That's something that in your IEP team meeting to discuss then. Or that's a starting point for it anyway.
Okay. Okay, someone saying, Chris, you mentioned that you don't recommend retention. Why not? Tell us.
You know, I think that it can, I'm not saying never, but I'm saying it can be problematic, because if you've got a child, particularly if you've got this, the fifth grader we just mentioned, who's 5'8", and you put him in fourth grade, or let's just say a normal size fifth grade, and you put him in fourth grade, it's, you know, they're going to feel, you know, there's going to be issues in terms of them being in a grade below. And those could, you know, cause issues as well. So you want to be really sure that this is a step you want to take as far as putting them in a grade below. They're always going to be in a grade below. I'd rather see them in the grade that they were in, and, you know, have comp ed, have other services to help them catch up so that they stay in the grade that they're in with their peers. You want to be as close as possible with the, you know, with your actual peers, you know, particularly your age group, I think. So, Allison, you have anything to add? Did I?
Yeah, I would agree, because I mean, retention there was a period like when I was growing up that they would freely retain students, including myself. But that has fallen out of favor for a lot of years, because of all the problems that can come with retention that Chris mentioned, like feeling, you know, you're actually more mature potentially than the other kids, but you're also taken away perhaps from the peers that you grew up with, and suddenly put with another group of students. That can be very humiliating. Now, right now, as I think Chris mentioned at the beginning of this, we're in a very unusual period, an unprecedented period, where so now retaining a child does not seem as big of a deal as it once did. However, that said, if your child is a teenager or middle schooler and you're retaining them, that could really be scarring. You know, it's one thing to retain somebody in kindergarten or first grade, but it's a whole other thing to retain someone in middle school or high school. That can cause some social scars.
It's tricky. It's very hard to make these decisions. Thank you for those answers. So as another question is, as you discuss home hospital, I'm concerned about the standards required to obtain a regular diploma versus certificate completion. Is there something specific parents should know when home hospital is the only option available?
Well, some people also like home hospital because you can get the credits that you would have gotten if you were able to go to school in person. So that's why some people like it, because I don't know if it's automatic exactly that you get the credits, but it's assumed that you will get the credits you need to move forward or to graduate.
I see. Okay.
Now, I don't know how you're going to do that, practically speaking, with an hour a day of instruction, particularly if you're in high school and you have lots of different subject matter and you need different teachers who are teaching the different subject matter. I have no idea how that's going to happen, whether you have a disability or not. But nonetheless, so you may be actually cheating your child out of an education, unintentionally, of course. Yeah.
Okay, we have another question. What response would you recommend for absences related to the pressure to attend in person as the only option in the IEP.
Do you mean that the student has anxiety about attending in person? Or what do you mean by the pressure to attend in person?
I'm assuming it's something COVID related, that they don't want to have the child in school because of COVID, but are saying that's the only option. They have to go to school. And this is exactly what we were talking about in terms of that pressure by the school. Don't give in. I mean, that's the point where go get a lawyer, because you don't have to send your kid to school, and they have to provide FAPE anyway. That alone is clear from 130. If the specific mechanism by which they do it is not clear. So they do not have to send this. They do not have to do in-person schooling.
So we need more options. We need better online options for those who are not going back to school right away. And that, I think, been a glaring omission in LAUSD in not offering that to parents.
Right.
You know,
I think every district, but some districts are more willing to offer ad hoc programs where they're just kind of making it up on the fly and saying, okay, we'll hire someone from Star Haynes, let's say, to come tutor your child for 2 days a week via Zoom, rather than, because you don't want them to go to school. So I haven't seen that LAUSD is willing to do that yet.
So what kind of accountability is there? If LAUSD is saying the only online option we're offering is City of Angels, yet at the same time, the IEP team might say, City of Angels is not fit for your child, and we're not authorizing that. But the doctor sent a note saying your child is medically fragile and should not go to school. Then LAUSD is not offering free, appropriate public education to that child. How is this possibly happening? Like, why? Where's the accountability?
This is where you file for due process, you file a state complaint. That is how you get accountability. Unfortunately, that's
right.
That's how you do it.
The dispute, there's ways to handle it, right? There's the state complaint, there's filing for due process, there's filing for mediation, there's other ADR, even if you have to go to ADR to try and work something out. So there's a lot of different ways to do it, but basically it's individualized. So every family has to fight their own fight. Maybe this cleanup bill will help, but we'll see.
Tell us about the cleanup bill. What is the cleanup bill?
It's in its infancy. I think they started planning it last week, and the idea being that there will be a bill that will fix what's wrong with AB 130, particularly the children with IEPs, the students with special needs that are not being covered by AB 130, because there's that huge hole, especially when you have the overlap of students with special needs and students that are medically fragile, right? I mean, that's a huge overlap there. So all of these students who aren't going back to school for good reason are not covered. So the cleanup bill hopefully will address that with some sort of distance learning. Yeah, hopefully. I make no promises.
Time is ticking. When is it happening?
I don't know. At this point, it's one off. It's every child, every family has to fight that fight themselves, unfortunately.
And I'm not suggesting you guys do this, and I'm not going to take this on, but do you think there is grounds for a class action lawsuit for what's happening? Or is that getting dangerous territory? Would you rather not say?
The problem with class action is that the IDEA does not allow for class actions. So there's no option under the main federal law protecting students with disability in school to file a class action. It's for individual parents to enforce their rights. So a class action would have to be filed in federal court under a different federal law. Then option would be for a group of parents who wanted to get together and had similar circumstances would file a complaint to the state, which is not litigation, it's a complaint, and it's, in theory, parents can do it themselves. If you Google California state complaint special education, you will find links for that. And let's say if parents out there, if there were 4 of them who are all, or 3 of them, or even 2 of them who are all in a similar situation, meaning they didn't qualify for independent study, or that didn't work for their kid, and hospital homebound wasn't appropriate, isn't enough, then those kids are in a very tight spot. Their rights are being violated. And I think there should be a state complaint filed against the state of California for that glaring hole. If there are a group of parents who want to come to me as a group who are all in similar circumstances, I would consider filing a state complaint based on those situations, that situation, because I think it's outrageous that the needs of special ed kids was really not anticipated for no apparent reason.
It was anticipated just enough to say, oh, this isn't for you. AB 130. Yeah, we don't think it's for you. So check with your IEP team, but we don't think it's for you. I mean, that's as far as it seems to have gone.
Yeah, I guess what they did consider was ADR for Comp Ed, to try to help parents get Comp Ed rather than suing school districts. But my guess is that it's the school districts which were part of the group. In fact, I know this is true. There's school districts which were part of the group which lobbied the legislature to make this ADR bill. Well, they weren't, it wasn't in their interest. That was in their interest to avoid due process. It wasn't in their interest to figure out what would happen to these kids this year. They're like, oh, we'll just let them fend for themselves, or we'll just try to force them to come in person. So that's unfortunately the way of the world.
All right, well, I wish we could all solve it tonight, but we can't. The best we can do is inform ourselves so that we go to our IEP team meetings empowered and ready with the information we need to advocate for our kids, and with the information we need to take it to the next step if the team is not able to offer us a solution that works for our kids. So I want to thank Chris and Allison, Chris Eisenberg, Allison Hertog, special ed attorneys, both with a real personal stake in this. Thank you so much for your advocacy and your legal counsel in general. And we will continue this conversation in a future date.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you for having us, Lisa.
Thank you.
Have a great evening.
You too. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.